Number 10, it's just a cold sore. The Victorian era is cool. The art, the fashion, and technology of the time, I think, are always fun to take a look at, especially since steampunk has its roots in the Victorian era, and who doesn't like steampunk? Come on, there's just a lot of cool steampunk stuff, and honestly, we haven't seen a lot of that in a long time. We need more. We need more. Something not so cool from that era, however, was what you could catch from another person should you decide to take up a bed with another person. Syphilis, yep, one heck of a disease. Funny enough, it was so common that it was making intimacy itself an unusual practice. People were scared, and honestly, maybe rightfully so. There's no cure, and if it progresses to its later stages back then, well, you go crazy. And then you'd end up being that guy that's always screaming in the streets. Every city has one. You know what I'm talking about. Number 9, the French letter. The issues of intimacy and its repercussions were becoming quite clear in the Victorian era. Something had to be done, as spending any amount of time in the brothels could have you shucking barnacles off your lower deck in the morning, if you know what I mean. Introducing the revolutionary new invention, prophylactics. For those that are college age, you might find it disturbing that these party favors weren't made of rubber or disposable. Yeah, hear me out. They were made of sheep's guts, and they had to be soaked first so they would become flexible. Because when you put these bad boys on, they had to be fastened on. It's not very good, not very attractive. Once the deed had been signed off on, the device was then washed and then hung up to dry like your dirty laundry. Once it was dry, it was placed in a small box for the next time. Because seeing your wife's ankles might make you feel a certain kind of way, and now you just have it ready to go. And number 8, the products of our sins. Having fun when the lights can be turned off is great. Who doesn't enjoy a little toe curling? Yeah? Except sometimes there's this crazy thing that can happen, where after 9 months, another human spawns in. Insane, right? I know. Well, back in the Victorian era, this phenomenon was happening, but only for married couples. As you have to be married, of course, or else a child would be born out of wedlock, which to people at the time was just the worst. Oh, I never. These stigmas were not favorable for women, as some preferred to avoid that kind of press by abandoning or straight up just unaliving their children. Horrible, just horrible times. Just another one of those good old wholesome times in history where we were treating women with the utmost respect and decency. Very nice. We were actually not very nice. Number 7, diet. Bedroom misconduct was becoming a huge issue. Refer to number 9 and 10. While women did get most of the blame because, well, you know, history, men did get some of the blame. The issue of intimacy for men could be described as barbaric primal sense. So how do we curb this? How do we stop men from acting on these caveman urges, ooga booga? Well, simple really. Men just have to stop eating certain foods, as it was thought at the time that food had a link to the misconduct, or rather, the overabundance of bedroom-related issues, including mustard, pepper, rich gravy, beer, wine, cider, and tobacco. And if you weren't paying attention, that's basically the diet of every man in Victorian times. Not sure how a jar of finely prepped mustard would get you flustered, but okay, sure. The beer makes sense though, you know, have a few beers, and even the mop leaning over in the corner looks pretty lonely, and boy, that mop has lovely hair. Number 6, job market. Ladies of the evening, women of the night. Women who make beds go bump in the night. They were everywhere in Victorian London, a lot. It's partially related to some of the points I previously mentioned. Now, I'm not here to say it's necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I don't think it is. As they say, it's the oldest profession in the book, with an estimated 80,000 women working in the night by the late 1890s. You'd have to be crazy to miss that. I mean, they were literally everywhere. With numbers like that, there's something for everyone and in varying price ranges, as they can be found in brothels or townhomes set up by the wealthy men for their mistresses, pretty much anywhere trouble likes to spawn. Even some artists took advantage of this by living with the gorgeous girls of the evening, as going behind closed doors with one was debatable, but becoming friends? Now that's a social transgression. Becoming friend, how dare you befriend the people of the night? Number 5, Jolly Lad. When people think about certain magazines that depict lewd imagery, you probably only think of Playboy. The bunny imagery was good marketing, honestly, just smart. But what if I told you the Hefmeister wasn't the first to publish such a magazine, or imagery? Back in the Victorian era, there was some saucy imagery being produced. The government had outlawed such indecency, but this only made the lewd picture industry move underground, where naturally it flourished, especially in major cities. And if you knew where to go and how to ask for one, you could purchase something from the hidden menu. Kind of like when you go to McDonald's. Yeah, there's a hidden menu there too. Google it and see for yourself. I'd repeat what my favorite one is, but I would be in trouble from the YouTube gods. And I've been treading on thin ice this whole video, so Number 4, the first counterculture. The 1960s were a very important time for many different people. Black Americans were fighting for the rights, music went from holding hands to strawberry fields, if you know what I'm saying, and everything that your parents told you just kind of felt wrong. If you grew up then, you know what I mean. I know people like to make fun of hippies, but there was some good ideas there. Well, in 1890s England, they were sort of having the same thing happen. Obviously not as strong as a push as it was in the 60s, but still. Basically, after all the oppression towards bedroom relations, people began to open up. Not literally, just open up thinking wise. That's really gross, don't repeat that. There's only one way we all got here. Unless you're a test tube baby, of course. In that case, thank you for watching CT133576-2. To some historians, this makes sense. When you push and push for things to happen or ban, eventually people will push back, especially if it's something like bedroom time. Everybody likes a little bit of bedroom time. Valentine's Day wasn't too long ago. Remember that? It was good. It was fun. It was good fun. Number 3, Jack the Ripper. While the man's numbers don't compare to any of the other horrible people in history, he's unusual because of his brutality and the fact that he was never caught. Jack the Ripper was maybe the first modern serial unaliver. He haunted the streets of Victorian London and is responsible for claiming multiple women's lives, women of the evening to be exact, and they began to know the name Jack the Ripper. Now, we'll probably just have to show you pictures of Victorian London or maybe some B-roll of a shadowy figure because there ain't no way we can show the crime scenes. There's probably a dozen different theories on who done it. Some say it was multiple men using his name as an alias, some say it was Prince Albert, there's even some who suggest that he was a she, and which explains why women were so easy to go off with Jack. That actually kind of makes sense to me at least, and why no one really would be looking for a woman back then. Kind of makes sense. Anyway, be careful out there ladies, just be careful. Number 2, Queen Victoria. It seems Blighty herself may have been a tad more promiscuous than you'd think a royal to be. Well, not with other men, but her husband, who in her diary claims to be the love of her life, which honestly is kind of sweet and romantic. That's nice. One thing that I find interesting, however, is that while lewd images were outlawed, the Queen may have commissioned a painting of herself that was quite risque for the time, to gift to her husband, of course. Hypocrisy much? I say lewd, but it was probably just in her loose-fitting clothes, with maybe like an ankle showing or something. Still, unusual behavior for the Queen. I'll remember that for next time, Blight. I'll remember that. Number 1, Prince Albert. If you've ever stepped foot into a tattoo parlor, then you might know where I'm going with this. Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, had some controversy circulating his name. One, because he shares a name with another Prince Albert who was speculated to be Jack the Ripper, but also because of a very unique piercing. Go ahead and take a guess where that piercing is. Yeah, I didn't think so. As a man, if your anatomy could be described by an internet comedian using moderately funny euphemisms, then the piercing would go through your German army helmet. That makes sense, right? The horror. The absolute horror. It's rumored that he had one of these piercings. Did he? I'm not sure. But if it means anything to you, Nicholas II had a tattoo, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Number 10. No calling, no gifts. This is a time in history when men were told to be gentlemen and women told to be ladies. Naturally, that came with some weird social practices. For instance, women were discouraged from accepting gifts from men. Personally, I like to give my girlfriend flowers and chocolate. I'm a classic guy, what can I say? Can't go wrong with that. However, even if a handsome silver-tongued devil such as myself were to give some flowers and the finest dark chocolate a 7-Eleven has to offer, and a most promising woman were to accept said gifts, she may not be able to call me back. Literally because, well, the phone isn't exactly a thing yet, and also because that's something else women were just discouraged from doing. Call on a man? No way, Jose. Even if he is super nice and waiting for a genuine response. One etiquette guidebook from 1882 called any woman who calls on a man ill-bred and positively improper to do so. I like when people give me flowers and chocolate. Maybe call me sometimes, I'm a little lonely. Number 9. Act like a lady. How dare ladies do anything unladylike? Oh, said every man ever in the Victorian era. This is a time in history when ladies gotta be ladylike. That means makeup, corsets, and don't you dare do anything masculine. Oh, that's me angry. This is still a time when food isn't the greatest either, so imagine if you got an upset tummy at the dinner table. Happens to me a lot. You've got a handsome prince that your parents have arranged for you to marry. When you go to greet him, you do it with a simple gesture as kneeling to curtsy could turn your linens a certain shade of embarrassment that 1800 stain cleaning technology could never wash away. You'd poop yourself. Where's Billy Mays when you need him, right? How dare women do such things as go number 2, or even worse, break wind? Oh, the nerve! That's just the way it went, folks. I don't make the rules. Number 8, charged with love. Naturally, this was the past, and not being open to homosexuality was just the way it was. Especially when tucking yourself into bed at night alone wasn't allowed either. Homosexuality just wasn't gonna happen. They just weren't gonna be approved of it. It's just how it goes. It sucks. However, it's almost as if there's been love on this earth since day one, and to stop that kind of love, it's just silly, man. Wherever I go, everyone is welcome on this channel, or my Twitch. Chetty loves everyone, because in reality, this is a time period where you could wind up in jail for that kind of love. And as Austin Powers would say, that's just not very groovy, baby, yeah. Strangely enough, homosexual relationships between women might have been completely overlooked, as they were sometimes mistaken for women being friends. Yeah, I know. Some women even lived together, but given that they probably needed each other for financial support, people just kind of thought that's how it went, and they ignored it. It's like they live together, and you start putting the pieces together, and it's like, you know, I don't know, something weird going on there. But love everybody, come on, be nice. Number 7, a good thing. If I'm talking about medieval times, there's a good chance I'm gonna bring up the super not cool, not fun, do not condone or support the behavior of marrying a woman at the age of 12. Yucky. In part 1, I mentioned that there was a ton of corners and streets being worked by the only other job besides street cleaners at 3 AM by women. However, after venereal disease was becoming a serious issue, it was getting pretty bad. It was becoming clear that a lot of people who were getting sick were young women, like 11 to 16 age group. Ooh. Which I shouldn't have to tell you is bad. That's pretty bad, dude. When I was 16, I was rocking Black Ops 2, hanging out with my buddies, and partying hard in the summer. I got a lot of good stories, maybe I'll share them one day. Catching all that nasty stuff is no way to spend your youth, so thank God the government changed the age of consent to 16 years old, which I know is not a solution for everything that was going on, but it was a small step forward in the right direction. That's what we like, good history, moving forward. We like that, Chetty likes. Number 6, the seamstress. Being that the Industrial Revolution had started and business was booming, people needed to travel for business, or more specifically, men needed to travel for business, which means they gotta be away from their wives, and that means they are away from the very thing we're talking about today, bedroom stuff. How did men solve this issue? Well, there was no shortage of ladies roaming street corners to aid in that matter. However, there's an option with a little less syphilis. There were aids or early blow-up dolls called travel ladies. Strangely enough, it was stored in a gentleman's hat. What? That's so wrong. Once it was ready to be used, it was inflated and reassembled. This is a quote from an ad from one of the products. It is inflated to the essential part of the woman wanted by a man. That just doesn't sound very good. This is why we have boards of people to check stuff from products before it gets shipped out to the public. I feel like that just wouldn't fly very well today. Number 5. Big polluter. This just doesn't make any sense. It never did to me, and it still doesn't. But in case you didn't know, self-pleasure was a big no-no, commonly called self-pollution, which honestly is very funny to me. That's just hilarious. Don't self-pollute yourself, Chris. That's bad. Don't do that. That's naughty. It was a sin and thought to be a cause for many ailments. I'm sure you've heard the classic saying that for guys, if you decided to go bump in the night by yourself, there's a good chance you'd need a walking stick because it would make you go blind. Women were also targeted, however, as for any pearl polishing by women was thought to be hysteric and needed to be treated for such. Look, the truth is, any man who wants to wax his carrot or woman tuning a one-dial radio should be able to do so without judgment of society or medical remedies of snake oil doctors. Love yourself, love everybody else, and just as long as the bedroom door's closed, you're good. Just don't do it in public, you're good. Number 4, shake and bake. I'm something of a scientist myself, but that doesn't mean I know everything, and if you actually need to learn something about health and safety, take it from a professional, not a second-rate John Candy. However, when coming across this fact, I just had to share it, because with my medical knowledge, this just doesn't sound right. Alright, so kids, we know how they're made. I don't need to go into detail for that. However, there was this idea back in the Victorian days that if a woman danced shortly after doing what mommy and daddies do, then there was a chance that her pregnancy just wouldn't happen. Or perhaps more commonly after riding a horse. Same idea. Okay. Which is frankly horse. I mean, come on. My mom always told me when she was baking that I had to be quiet and stop running around the house or the cake she was baking wouldn't rise. Well, they always did. I love chocolate cake. I mean, really, I do. I'm starting to wonder if there's a connection here. I was a rowdy kid. Number 3, the Kensington System. Poor Queen Victoria. I know this is kind of a stretch, but it relates back to the whole mistreating women thing. But basically, it was something implemented in order to control the young royal, make her dependent on her mother, whom she was not allowed to be without. Basically, modern day strict parents. Now, all the kids watching right now, or all the kids who've grown up, how well did that parenting work? Let us know in the comments. I'm willing to bet it created a little bit of a divide between parent and child. Am I right? That's exactly what happened with Queen Victoria. Shouldn't be surprised, really. Being a parent is tough. I get that. But squeeze too hard and the sand falls through the cracks of your hand. Victoria wasn't even allowed an hour to herself. And I don't care who you are, no matter how charismatic or bubbly. Everybody needs some alone time. Number 2, a healthy breakfast. Okay, not Victorian London, but this is just too funny not to mention, and it's around the same time period, very close. As the great minds of the time thought, self-pollution was a big no-no, and the reason for these urges was often related to food. Some thought eating meat would make you down bad, so a man named John Harvey Kellogg, you might have heard of him, aimed to cure the sickness of self-love. What if a man had a delicious, nutritious meal to eat, especially at the start of his day? Cornflakes by Kellogg's, the very same cereal that's probably sitting on top of your fridge, yeah, was partially originally designed to stop you from feeling those carnal urges. Now, not sure if that works. I mean, go ahead and tell me how you feel after eating a bowl of that. I had one this morning. I feel fine. I don't feel any different at all. I mean, I'm just, well, not really feeling the same about Pam Anderson anymore though. Number 1, rising action. This could get some married couples into some trouble if they're watching, so sorry. It's gonna be hard to talk about this without saying it because YouTube will send a stern letter if I do, but here it goes. The deed was not considered done unless both parties had signed off on it, had their toes curled, reaching the peak, your magnum opus, the way I feel when I eat at McDonald's, DEFCON 1, or simply mispronouncing organisms in health class. I feel like once you're involved, you're involved. And to me, that's a done deal. You can't really reverse it from that point on, regardless of any of my euphemisms, but that's what they thought. They thought if you both didn't climb that mountain together, it didn't happen. 'Cause science.
Alrighty, let's dive into the grim yet fascinating world of Victorian era hangings with a bit of a casual twist. Imagine a time when Netflix wasn't around and people needed some form of entertainment. Gruesome as it may sound, public hangings were kind of like the morbid blockbusters of the Victorian era. Now, hanging wasn't just a drop in the park, it was a go-to showstopper for very serious crimes. Think of it as the ultimate deterrent, a stark warning that crime doesn't pay, especially not in an era where stealing a loaf of bread could land you in a world of trouble. It went a little something like this. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. I would love to be a town crier. Oh my god. Those guys had all the tea. Just going and yelling at everybody. Oh I really wanted to do a town crier impersonation, but I just can't yell in here. Chris's ears would explode. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. Flyers are posted and word spreads like wildfire. On the big day, people flock from far and wide, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. There are vendors selling snacks, folks jostling for the best view, and an air of anticipation that's hard to miss. The condemned, often paraded through the streets, would then face their final curtain on the gallows, a platform designed for the very purpose of ending lives. The executioner, sometimes hooded, would place the rope around the prisoner's neck, a process watched with bated breath by the crowd. A quick pull of the lever and it was all over. But here's a twist in the tale. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were also seen as moral lessons. Live action morality plays meant to instill fear and promote good behavior. Yet, the spectacle sometimes backfired. Sympathies occasionally swayed towards the unfortunate soul on the gallows, especially if the crowd deemed their crime petty or their behavior sympathetic. By 1868, Britain decided this was all a bit too much for public sensibilities and moved executions behind the solemn walls of prisons, away from the public's prying eyes and picnics. So next time you're queuing for the latest movie or binge watching a series, spare a thought for the Victorians, for whom a day out might have just involved a bit of gallows theater, complete with real life drama, tragedy, and unfortunately no encore for the star of the show. Ooh. Alright, next up on our list we have flogging. Spare the rod and spoil the child. If you've heard this phrase before, imagine it being taken to the extreme, as they often did in the Victorian era. Flogging wasn't just a quick slap on the wrist, it was a full-on event with the person typically tied up and given a set number of lashes that could leave scars for life. This punishment wasn't exclusive to hardened criminals. Oh no, even some of the more vulnerable members of our communities could get a taste of the whip for acting up. And soldiers or sailors might find themselves on the receiving end for stepping out of line. The idea was that a good thrashing could correct any number of moral or disciplinary issues. Sounds pretty harsh, right? Well, that was Victorian justice for you. Very much about making the punishment fit the crime, with a side of public humiliation to ensure you'd think twice before stepping out of line again. Next up on our list today we have the debtor's prison. Imagine a world where you've just run out of luck with your finances and bam, you're sent off to a debtor's prison, which is about as fun as it sounds. So, not fun at all. These places were grim. Think of the worst hotel you've ever seen, then remove any windows, heating, or good food. In debtor's prison, you were stuck until your debt was paid off, but here's where things get even more interesting. How in the world are you supposed to settle your debts when you're locked up and you can't work? It's kind of like trying to run a marathon with your legs tied together. Meanwhile, your family on the outside, yeah, forgot about them, they're just scrambling to get by without their main money earner, which often plunged them into their own financial crisis. Love that. It was just a vicious cycle that didn't do much for actually solving the problem of debt. Instead, it just added a hefty dose of misery and despair to the mix. It sounds like the Victorian era was actually just a lot of that. Misery and despair. So next time you're fretting about paying bills, just be thankful you're not doing it Victorian style, I guess. Or else I'd be in Rogers prison for my phone bill. Next up we have the scolds bridal. Back in the Victorian era, if a woman was labeled a bit too chatty or opinionated, heaven forbid she actually nag, she might find herself in the not so stylish accessory known as the scolds bridle. Imagine a heavy, clunky metal mask clamping over your head, complete with a gag right in your mouth to put the kibosh on any further chit chat. Okay, not exactly the pinnacle of fashion or comfort, right? This contraption wasn't just about silencing, it was the 19th century version of public shaming with a generous dash of misogyny. Women were paraded around, their speech literally bridled as a warning to others that speaking out of turn wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Thankfully, we've relegated such barbaric practices to the history books, but the scolds bridle remains a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding and respecting individual rights and voices. Moving on down our list, we are talking about transportation next. Imagine you're living in 19th century Britain and things are frankly pretty bleak if you're not wearing a top hat and tails. Now imagine you've been caught stealing a loaf of bread or, heaven forbid, a handkerchief. The punishment? Well, you're not just going to the local jail, you're being shipped off to the other side of the world. Transportation meant being packed off to Australia or Tasmania, places that were as remote and alien as the moon for many Brits at the time. These were no pleasure cruises. The journey alone could take months on cramped, disease-ridden ships where survival was a coin toss. Once you arrived, if you were still kicking, congratulations! Your prize was hard labor in brutal conditions, often in chain gangs or remote outposts where the sun seemed to have a personal personal vendetta against you. And forget about a leisurely pint at the pub, you were there to work, building the infrastructure for new colonies, often in sweltering heat or other extreme conditions. Speaking of hard labor, the good old Victorian era, where they took no pain, no gain to a whole new level, especially in prisons. So imagine you've been nabbed for stealing a loaf of bread, and yes, this is the only example I will be using, like I'm Jean Valjean himself. So imagine you stole the bread and bam, you're sentenced to hard labor. And we're not talking about breaking a sweat at the gym, we're diving into the world of the treadmill and the crank machine. Victorian style gym equipment from your worst nightmare. Imagine being stuck on a never-ending stairmaster, the treadmill, not for your health, but as punishment, climbing to nowhere for hours. Then there's the crank machine, a mind-numbing device that had prisoners turn a crank a mind-blowing number of times just to complete their daily quota. And for what? Absolutely nothing. No purpose, no product, just pure fatigue and despair. It was the era's twisted way of teaching a lesson, breaking spirits under the guise of building character. So next time you moan about your gym routine, just remember it could have been a Victorian prison workout, alright? It's not so bad. You got this. Just a couple more flights of stairs. I don't know, I'm turning into David Goggins here. Almost called him Jimmy Goggins for some reason. I don't know where that came from. Okay, anyways. Next up on our list we have the pillory and stocks. Oh, the pillory and stocks. Imagine you're walking down the street in Victorian times and there's someone's head and hands locked up, sticking out of a wooden frame. Definitely quite the sight. This was the era's version of trending on social media, but instead of likes and shares, you get rotten tomatoes to the face. The poor folks caught in these contraptions were there for everyone to see, often in the town square, serving as a living warning against misbehaving. Passerbys weren't shy about expressing their opinions either. They'd hurl anything from spoiled veggies to less savory items, making sure the punished got their share of public scorn. It wasn't just about the physical discomfort, which was definitely no picnic, mind you, but the real kicker was the embarrassment. Imagine being the center of negative attention with every local and their dog coming out to see you as the day's unfortunate spectacle. Definitely not the kind of fame anyone would want. Also, there was like 10 people alive at this time. Everyone knows your business now. How embarrassing. Next up, let's dive into the eerie world of solitary confinement, Victorian style. Perhaps an even more miserable twist on a punishment that still exists today. You're locked up all by yourself in a tiny, gloomy cell with nobody to chat with but the spiders weaving their webs in the corner. Definitely not as nice as Charlotte. This was the reality for prisoners in the separate system, notably at places like the Eastern State Penitentiary in the US and Pentonville Prison in the UK. The idea was kind of like a forced meditation retreat minus the zen and the tranquility. They thought making prisoners sit alone with their thoughts would lead to soul searching and moral reform. And this sounds very noble, of course, but in practice, it turned out to be more like a recipe for a mental breakdown. The isolation was so intense that many inmates ended up more losing their minds than reaching enlightenment. While it was all the rage back in the day, we now do know that too much alone time, especially in a dreary cell, can do more harm than good. Next up today, we are diving into the world of branding. It's the early Victorian era, a time when top hats were all the rage, and so, unfortunately, was branding people. Yes, you heard that right. Back in those days, if you were a soldier or a sailor who tried to ditch your duties or got caught doing something naughty, you might end up with a hot iron pressed against your skin. Ouch! Now, this wasn't your subtle, hide it under your shirt kind of mark. We're talking about a blazing hot iron stamping a symbol on your face, your hand, or anywhere that it would be visible. The idea was to not just punish, but to label you as a wrongdoer for everyone to see. It was kind of like walking around with a "I made a big oopsie" sign etched on your skin. This brutal calling card did more than just sting and leave a scar. It messed up how people saw you, and it slashed your chances of getting decent work. In a world without second chances, this was a harsh way to learn a lesson. So next time you think about skipping out on your duties, remember that in history, that might have ended up with you quite literally being branded for life. And finally on our list today we have public whipping. I've definitely learned that during the Victorian era they liked all the craziest things to be a public spectacle. So imagine you're walking through a Victorian era town square and suddenly there's a crowd gathering. Something's going down and it's not the local fair, it's a public whipping. So some poor soul, shirt ripped off, is tied to a post right in the center of the action. The whip cracks, and it's not just the sound that sends shivers down your spine, it's the whole thing. People are watching, some with horror, others with a kind of grim satisfaction, as each lash marks the offender's back. The idea? It's not just about the pain, which is definitely plenty, but it's also about the embarrassment of being the day's main entertainment. Getting whipped in front of your neighbors, or worse, your family, is like adding a massive scoop of shame to your pain Sunday. Victorian society was big on moral lessons, and public whipping was like a live-action cautionary tale, saying break the rules and this could be you. Kind of puts a whole new spin on the idea of a public spectacle, doesn't it?
In the Victorian era, you would wash your hair with eggs. You would massage egg bits all over your scalp, all in the name of hygiene. Here are the 10 Victorian era hygiene practices that will surprise you. Number 10. Gross hair care. The Victorians had an odd fascination with hair. The concept of modern shampoo was not yet realized, so we had to put some nasty stuff in there beforehand. Women commonly applied eggs to their hair, massaging the substance in their scalps before, obviously and thankfully, rinsing it away forever. Another favorite method involved using vinegar mixed with water for cleansing. It would work, but it wouldn't necessarily smell the best. Interestingly enough, a variety of kitchen staples found alternate use as hair cleaning agents before the advent of shampoo. Ingredients such as rosemary, black tea, and even rum, believe it or not, were all regularly employed for washing your hair, reflecting the era's innovative approaches to personal hygiene, if you want to call it that. Number 9. No plumbing. In the Victorian era, toilets, often referred to then as water closets, were a luxury not afforded to all. For those middle and upper classes, flush toilets began to replace the early chamber pots and outdoor privies, but the sewage systems were still quite primitive, leading to contamination of water sources and of course outbreaks of diseases like cholera. So we could flush it, but then we'd get really sick. It would just mix and go into our eyes and mouth. The poor, meanwhile, relied on communal outhouses that were rarely cleaned, of course posing severe health risks as well. Additionally, the lack of understanding regarding bacteria and the spread of disease meant that these toilets, particularly in densely populated areas, definitely contributed to the high mortality rates of the time due to poor sanitation practices. Number 8. Russian bath. As bathing became more common among the Victorians, guidebooks, believe it or not, books on how to bathe yourself emerged to navigate the newfound territory of personal hygiene. Step 1. Add water. Awesome, got that one, we knew it. One notable guide featured a range of toilet recipes aimed at those unfamiliar with the practice of bathing. Recipes, that's a gross word for bath stuff. Among the various pieces of advice, a caution similar to the modern myth about swimming suggested that you should avoid baths within 4 hours after consuming a substantial meal. Yeah, you'd sink to the bottom. Who knows? You go down the drain, it'd be a horrible demise. Travelers were particularly cautioned against washing their faces with water that hadn't been treated with alcohol or ammonia to ensure its purity. It's like going to Mexico. You're like, don't drink the water. Please God, do not drink the water. Among the beauty treatments of the time, the Russian bath definitely stood out, advocating for the use of alternating hot and cold water washes on the face, using this as a method to ward off wrinkles. Yeah, they would dump their feces into a river, but they were worried about wrinkles. Number 7. Bad smells. In the Victorian era, bad odors were regarded not merely as a nuisance, but as a health hazard. The prevailing miasma theory, or the belief in night air, posited that diseases such as chlamydia and cholera were transmitted through polluted air. This perspective led to the assumption that the dire health conditions in London slums were a result of the foul odors coming in through these neighborhoods. Just a bad odor, just a ghost of odors coming in, that's all that is. Even the esteemed nurse Florence Nightingale, she subscribed to the miasma theory, advocating for the importance of fresh air for patient recovery. Yes, ironically, it was the inadequate sanitation in industrial zones that both facilitated the spread of disease and contributed to the unpleasant smells. It was just a circle of yuck. In contemporary times, the miasma theory has been debunked by advances in sanitation and medical science, of course reshaping our understanding of disease transmission. Number 6, the Great Stink. Even today's cities can smell pretty bad in the summer heat. Believe me, I live in Toronto. It can get pretty horrible. But in 1858, London's stench was so unbearable, it halted city life. Yeah, we just went home from work, it smelled that bad. The River Thames, now a scenic spot, I've visited there quite a few times, it's pretty amazing. This was essentially London's sewage dump at the time. Just throw it on in, plenty of room. What's the worst that could happen? The river's horrendous smell led Londoners to complain, and even doctors blamed it for widespread disease. You come in, they're like, oh, it's the river over there. Avoid that river, go home this way. That's a dirty river. This period was dubbed the Great Stink. Appropriately so. Action was only taken when the Thames odors reached Parliament, prompting the rapid passage of a bill within 18 days to create a modern sewage system for London. Yeah, it took them 18 days to figure out. The rest of us is like, go struggle for a year or two. We'll figure it out eventually. Number 5, clothing. During the Victorian period, the design of women's clothing was accused of contributing to the transmission of tuberculosis. It was believed that long skirts sweeping through the streets could collect the disease and then later introduce it into homes. You're mixing up a cloud of danger between your legs, then you go home and then you let it all out. Additionally, the restrictive corsets worn by women were known to make TB worse, believe it or not, due to their lung constricting nature. Yeah, you got a cough, got something going on in your chest, tie it up real tight. That'll help, you'll look great. It's the Victorian era. As a preventative measure, shorter skirts and more relaxed corsets were adopted in hopes of curtailing the disease's spread. And it also helped when women could breathe while wearing clothing. That's just great, we love that on all fronts. Number 4, night workers. Despite societal disapproval, many women in London's poor districts turned to escort work as means of income. You know, the night workers, that's what I'm talking about. The lack of medicine led to the frequent transmission of STDs from these workers to their clients, and subsequently to the clients' spouses. It's a fun little triangle there, a lot of explaining to do when we get home. The rampant spread of STDs, of course, turned into a massive public health challenge. Everyone's like, what's going on? Why are we so itchy? Can we stop this? This promoted government intervention. As a result, women who were engaged in nighttime professions were subject to detention and mandatory treatment for these diseases if caught, while their male patrons faced minimal repercussions. Number 3, vinegar and zinc baths. During the Victorian era, daily bathing was not a common practice due to the lack of indoor plumbing and also the lack of knowledge and water. We didn't have any of the above. It was all a mess. To combat body odor, people would actually use a mixture of vinegar and zinc as a topical application. Ugh, that makes me so itchy already. This was rubbed onto the skin in the belief that it would kill bacteria and remove odors. The odors, not so much, but it did something. Vinegar, being acidic, was considered effective in killing off bacteria, while zinc was thought to have a similar antibacterial property. Yes, welcome to the Victorian era. Yeah, step into my water closet. Now rub this zinc all over your skin and go to sleep. Totally normal. Welcome, stay the night. Oh, this one really sucks. I hate leeches so much. Leeches were widely used in Victorian medicines as a form of bloodletting, believed to balance the humors in the body and thus cure or prevent various diseases. This form of therapy was applied for conditions ranging from headaches to more serious ailments like infections. Yeah, you have a headache, they throw a leech on you. Thanks. Leeches were applied to the affected area and allowed to suck blood, supposedly drawing out the bad blood responsible for said illness. I had a leech stuck on my toe when I was younger once, and I just ripped the thing off. Gone. You're not even supposed to do that. I don't even know how I did that. I just pulled it off. I almost fainted. I hate leeches. Let's move on real quick. Number 1, tooth cleaning with soot and salt. In the Victorian era, dental hygiene was rudimentary compared to today's standards. It didn't exist at all. One common practice for cleaning your teeth was using a mixture of soot and salt. Soot and salt, there we go, we're brushing up. No tooth tunes, just soot. Toothbrushes, similar to those that we use today, did exist, but they were not widely accessible due to their cost. Yeah, they weren't giving these out for free back then, no siree. Hence, people used their fingers or cloth to rub this mixture onto their teeth. Soot was believed to have abrasive properties that could remove plaque, while salt acted as an antiseptic.
Starting off today, we are diving into the world of mental asylums. Mental asylums during the Victorian era are definitely not your modern day rehab center. These places were like the catch-all bucket for anyone society didn't quite know how to handle. Not just for those grappling with mental illness, but also for people who just didn't fit the very tight Victorian mold. Got a rebellious streak, or just too loud for your neighbor's liking. You might just find yourself locked up in one of these gloomy asylums. And let me tell you, the conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. We're talking about overcrowding, minimal if any real mental health treatment, and methods of confinement that could make even the sanest person question their sanity. It was less about healing and more about hiding away the problematic ones out of society's sight. Imagine being treated more like a prisoner in a dungeon than a patient in a hospital. That was the harsh reality of Victorian mental asylums. Next up on our list today, we have peine forte et dure. Imagine being accused of a crime in the not so good old days, and there you are, stubbornly refusing to plead guilty or not guilty because you know the system is rigged. Enter the nightmare fuel of the medieval world. This gruesome punishment method was something straight out of a horror flick. The accused would be laid flat and a board would be placed on top of their chest. Then stones, cold, heavy stones, are piled onto the board one by one. The weight increases, the breathing gets harder, and why endure such torture? It's all because of a loophole. By not pleading guilty or not guilty, the accused could avoid a formal trial, which meant even if they died under the weight, their family could still inherit their stuff. It was a brutal, desperate gamble. Though officially scrapped just before the Victorian era kicked in, the sheer horror of this punishment lingered in the public memory, kind of like the ghost of punishments past whispering, "Be glad you live in the now." Next up, we are journeying over to the gibbet. The gibbet, or gibbeting, was like a horror movie of old school punishments. So picture this. After the execution took place, the criminal wasn't just buried and forgotten about. Nope, that would just be too easy, I guess. Their body instead was sometimes locked up in an iron cage and hung from a tall frame called a gibbet, kind of like a creepy bird cage, but for humans. This wasn't tucked away in some dark corner either. It was of course out in the open where everyone could see it. The body was left to hang there, decomposing in the open air come rain or shine. Why the public display? Well, it was all about scare tactics. The sight of a swinging, decaying corpse was supposed to frighten anyone from thinking about breaking the law. Fair enough. It was a very stark, gruesome reminder plastered right in the town square. Break the law and you could be the next ghastly attraction. Yikes. Talk about a deterrent. I don't think I'd commit any crime after that, actually. It's crazy. Even just like Scared Straight or whatever that show is, like that was enough for me. Just a real dead body hanging in the middle of the town square. So scary. Okay. I don't think I'd do well in the Victorian era, but I guess they wouldn't do well now. Imagine showing like TikTok to a Victorian child. Next up on our list today, we are talking about hulks. Before dedicated prisons became widespread, hulks were a common form of punishment. At first, hulks sounds more like something from like a pirate adventure than real life, but trust me, it was far from a swashbuckling good time. Before the days of modern prisons, these old creaky warships, stripped of their glory and no longer seaworthy, were anchored permanently in harbors to house prisoners. Imagine being crammed into the dank, dark belly of a decommissioned ship with scores of other unfortunate souls. Conditions on these floating prisons were nothing short of nightmarish. They were overcrowded, they were festering with disease, and the air was thick with despair. Prisoners were often put to back-breaking work during the day, maybe hammering away at shipbreaking or toiling in nearby docks or riverbanks, and life on a hull was just a grim, a slow, and a steady descent into misery, making it one of the punishments from the past that was as much about enduring harsh conditions as it was about serving time. Next up on our list today, we have shame. Public humiliation was a go-to tactic in the punishment playbook during the Victorian era, and honestly even before that. Imagine being caught for a petty theft or a public nuisance, and instead of just serving time or getting a ticket, you're slapped with a giant sign spelling out your crime, and then you are paraded around town. Or perhaps you'll find yourself locked in the stocks, stuck in one uncomfortable position in the town square. Here, everyone from cheeky kids to stern old-timers could get a good look at you, and they didn't just stare. Of course not. They jeered, they tossed rotten tomatoes, or worse, sometimes. It wasn't just about making you rethink your life choices, it was about showing everyone else what could happen if they stepped out of line. This kind of punishment turned lawbreakers into live lessons in morality with a side of entertainment Victorian style. Kinda makes you glad that all you get is a parking ticket these days, right? I'm just saying, alright? Put that in the gratitude journal this morning. Next up on our list today we have the drunkard's cloak. Speaking of shame, this was one method that definitely worked to embarrass anyone out of committing this crime, and it also showed that maybe the Victorians had a bit of a sense of humor, although a very morbid one. So imagine you're in a bustling town square and there's someone looking quite ridiculous and moving awkwardly among the crowd. This poor soul is decked out in the infamous drunkard's cloak, which is basically a barrel turned into a heavy, uncomfortable garment. Think of it as the original cone of shame, but for humans. This barrel, often with holes for the arms and head, turned public drunks into walking spectacles. Walking around in this bulky, clunky barrel made any movement a challenge and attracted all kinds of stares, snickers, and maybe even a few rotten tomatoes from onlookers. This cloak wasn't just a punishment, it was a public statement. I partied too hard, and look where it got me. Designed to shame the wearer and entertain the public, the drunkard's cloak was a bizarre blend of punishment and street theater. So next time you're thinking about overdoing it at happy hour, just be thankful you're not doing so in a time when the hangover could involve navigating the local market in a barrel. That would be horrible. Next up on our list, we have the silent system. Imagine stepping into a Victorian era prison and hearing absolutely nothing. That would be so creepy, right? And that is the silent system for you. Introduced as a shiny new way to keep prisoners from corrupting each other with their criminal chatter, this system took solitary confinement up a notch. Inmates were not only isolated, but were also required to remain completely silent. The idea was that the silence would help them reflect on their crimes and reform. Sounds noble in theory maybe, but in practice it was a lot more like psychological torture. The utter lack of conversation, the inability to express any thoughts or feelings often drove prisoners to the brink of madness. This eerie quiet was intended to cleanse their moral palate, but instead it often led to severe mental breakdowns. Talk about a punishment that leaves you speechless, literally and figuratively. Next up we are talking about the body. So imagine being punished for a brutal crime only to have your punishment last into and after your death. It sounds kind of extreme, right? Well, back in the Victorian era, for some particularly nasty crimes, the punishment didn't just stop with their last breath. Nope, back in the day, the justice system had a bit of a flair for the dramatic and the downright macabre. So after the execution, they might prop up the criminal's body for all to see, turning it into a public spectacle. Talked about this a little bit, thinking of it as a chilling warning sign like behave or this could be you. But wait, it gets even more gruesome. Sometimes they'd even dissect the body. Yeah, I don't know why. They'd slice it open, pull it apart, often in front of an audience. This wasn't just for science, it was showbiz, Victorian style. It was like their way of saying the law had not only the power to take your life, but also to command your body after death. A reminder that the justice system held all the cards, making sure the memory of your deeds lived on as a lesson for everyone else. Next up on our list, we are talking about the shot drill. Okay, so you're in a Victorian era prison yard and there's no gym, but there's plenty of what you might call forced fitness. Enter the shot drill, a grueling exercise that could make even the toughest gym class look like an absolute walk in the park. Imagine lugging a hefty cannonball, hoisting it up to your chest with both hands, and then shuffling across the prison yard to drop it off at the other end. Sounds pretty tough, right? So now picture doing that just over and over again from sun up to sundown. This wasn't just about keeping prisoners busy or whatever, it was back-breaking work meant to drain their energy and break their spirits. The shot drill was the Victorian penal system's way of adding insult to injury, keeping you physically exhausted and constantly reminded of your captive state. Talk about a heavy day's work. Imagine doing all of that, so you gotta do all of those drills with a cannonball also, like we had nothing else, and then you gotta go inside and just be quiet after that. You just can't talk at all. That would just suck. Okay, I don't know, man. I really don't think I would have done well in the Victorian era. Okay, and finally on our list today we have oakum picking. So imagine, again, you're a prisoner in the Victorian era, sentenced to oakum picking. Sounds like something kind of out of a craft fair, but way better than that shot drill sentence. Well, maybe not quite. Imagine sitting there day after day, tearing apart old, tar-soaked ropes that used to hold ships together. Your task is to pull these gritty, sticky ropes apart until all that's left are the fibers, which then get reused to plug up leaks in ships, or stuff the very mattress you might be sleeping on, if you can call it sleeping. This isn't just tough on the mind, it is brutal on the hands. As you separate these fibers, your hands start to cramp, ache, and even bleed, thanks to the relentless, jagged edges of the rope. And just when you think you can't take another minute, you realize that your shift is not even close to being over. Oakum picking isn't just a job, it's a test of endurance, turning each day into a gritty battle against ropes that seem as tough as the life you are trying to survive.
Kicking off the list at number 10, a lot of hair. To kick off this wild part 2, I had to include the tale of the woman who ate her own hair. Why did she do it? What happened? How much hair? Well, let's find out. All the questions about to be answered. The Liverpool Daily Post back in 1869 got the attention of those passerbyers with this one. A 30-year-old passed away in the village of Lincolnshire. That's not too far off from the average life expectancy of the 1800s, but this case was a little odd. Something was off about it. So doctors asked the family if they could carry out a post-mortem, and lo and behold, a 2-pound solid chunk of hair was sitting in her stomach. It caused ulcerations of the stomach and ultimately caused her death. What a horrible way to go out. The woman's sister didn't note that over the last dozen years or so, she had been casually eating her own hair, just one piece every now and then. Ultimately, it added up. If you know anybody that's eating their own hair, pass this on. Send them this video. This sounds rather uncomfortable. Number 9, cat attack. If I have to pick, I would say I'm 100% a dog guy. Cats are cool, don't get me wrong, but this next story freaks me out a bit. Also, I had a cat once and I pulled its tail on it. Hissed at me and scratched me and scared the life out of me. So, dogs for sure. Back in 1870, a rich woman had put her time, energy, and resources into cat breeding. What a fun little hobby and lifestyle. She had tons of cats, she loved them all equally, and they loved her. I'm allergic also, so this story is my nightmare on a level. But it does sound like a cute time, I'll admit, that's a nice way. Especially like in the Victorian era, what a lovely little pocket of fun. 1800s, a lot of candles, everything being extremely flammable, disaster hit often in Victorian times. And in 1870, a fire broke out of this young woman's home, and the cats were sadly trapped in the house. They made it out alive, but by the time they made it out, the 2 maids that had kicked the door open to rescue them, they had gone full primal. The cats just attacked them and it was all bad. The fire in the house had obviously scared them, so when the doors were open, these 2 maids were both attacked by them at full force, essentially, all of these cats. Like, what a horrible thank you for saving all of their lives, you know what I mean? Number 8, quick divorce. Let's just say the love thing isn't working out, okay? It happens, people change, but now what? Say it's the Victorian era, but divorce in England isn't allowed until 1857, and it's 1856. So now what are we gonna do? Well, considering what list we're on and which part it is, it's pretty wildly unfair. If you were the wife, you were getting sold in this scenario. How horrible is that? Wife sellers, they were a thing. That was a legitimate business. How horrible. Yeah, you were getting sold if you were the wife. How horrible is that? Wife sellers was a legitimate business. There were auctions. Public auctions would be done. You would watch people bid on marrying your wife. At like noon, middle of the day, people are walking by like, oh, do I have any change? Hang on. This is insane. One real sale that happened in 1862 was in Selby. The asking price was a beer. The asking price for this person's wife was 1 pint. Sold, just like that. That's crazy. Sold, drank, now I'm married. That's insane. Other times, most of the time, it was a rather expensive exchange. I feel like there are plenty of cases where this would honestly be the ideal scenario. Just get it done in one day, whatever. Peace. See you again. Bye. You're the worst. Number 7, the Great Famine. We're gonna lean out of wife selling for a hot minute and include the boys for this one. Yeah, come on back in, you're all guilty. The Great Famine took out everybody, not just Victorian women of course. Back in 1845, potato crop that a lot of the Irish population was relying on was no longer available all of a sudden. A group of microorganisms just wiped them out, just like that, and in result, around 1 million folks died or had to leave. It was draconian law and British ruling that made the exported food hard to reach people that really needed it. So this famine led to Irish independence and anti-union movements. Little fun bit of history I had to include on this one. Number 6, the Brooklyn Theater Stampede. And we're back to absolute horribleness. Here we go. I love the theater. When the pandemic shut down plays, I actually felt pretty sad. I like sitting in full rooms watching a guy in a fake wig monologue about Mozart. Like, that's my ideal Saturday night. That's the best. I don't want that to not be a thing anymore. I love theater. But today we have an obnoxious amount of distractions that can take you out of the experience. Guy's texting fighting his ex-girlfriend 2 rows ahead of me. I'm trying to watch Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm like, man, it's not the same anymore. Theater's not the same anymore. Turn off your phone. Throw a tomato at him. It can be distracting. Exit signs can also be pretty distracting. But we need them. We definitely need them. Because in 1876, the Brooklyn Theater caught fire after a single lantern fell over on stage during a performance. This was 1876. Everybody was wearing flammable attire. There aren't emergency exits yet. A fire marshal hadn't come in and counted heads at this point, so it was a disaster. 278 people lost their lives. A monument was put up after the incident. It shook the town. It was absolutely horrible. I read about this and I was like, that's horrible. We got included in. This is a horrible list. Number 5, the Hobble Skirt. Yeah, so when people can't get out of burning theaters, it's stuff like this to blame. Just from this 1910 headline alone, I'm glad we don't have hobble skirts anymore. The June 12, 1910 headline reads, "The hobble skirt is the latest freak in women's fashions." The latest freak. Skirts that are so tight around the ankle that locomotion is seriously impeded and speed is impossible. Nice. I'll take 2, debit. Doesn't that sound like a bad time? Why would anyone want this? Sounds like you're gonna be late for everything. French designer Paul Poirier made these to free the bust, to free the, have a lot of room in here, whilst shackling the legs. So you in turn you can't move. Just what you need to move around uneven stone roads, I guess. Love the practicality on this one, Paul, thanks. Despite how ridiculous and unsafe the hobble skirt looks and acts, only the wealthy could afford such a thing. Shoot! Oh man, must be nice. I'll just be over here wearing jeans like an idiot. Middle and lower class women wore skirts with slits or buttons so they could, actually walk around. Yeah, what fools. Oh, sorry, you want a button? I don't speak broke, sweetie. Number 4, lead-based. When I started here at the studio a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years, I was like, okay, I gotta put on face cream maybe. A lot of lights, a lot of HD. Time to get rid of these bags under my eyes finally. I don't know, maybe drink some water. See what happens. Finding a skincare routine of any sorts is easy now, dare I say. The lovely World Wide Web has our back. You can learn how to draw your eyebrows on while listening to true crime. It's wonderful where we are today. But the cosmetic game, back in the 18th century, not great. Turns out wasn't that great, not that safe. RuPaul's Drag Race would have been a lethal sport, know what I mean? Back in the 18th century, lead mixed with vinegar was often used to make your face look, more pale. The Victorian look, I guess, gotta have those veins pop out. A splash of sulfur for those freckles. Horrible idea. Queen Elizabeth I used cosmetics containing lead, mercury, and or arsenic, the same poison that took out George III and Napoleon Bonaparte, so not safe at all at any time, period. In fact, arsenic was on the priority list of hazardous substances, and toxic metal exposure is still an issue we're facing in this era, let alone Victorian. Number 3, the Kensington System. This was horrible. Queen Victoria was brought up under the Kensington System, which if you haven't heard of before is awful. I was grounded more often than not growing up, I'll admit, I was the youngest of 3, so I tried some shady stuff every now and then, but this is another level. At least I could go to the washroom without supervision, you know what I mean? Yeah, buckle up. Victoria's mother, Duchess Victoria of Kent, she created this Kensington system to control her daughter. She literally isolated the child from friends, family members, anybody, everybody, you name it. Her mother would monitor her every action on top of this, including who she can see or speak to, if there were any of those people at some point. Victoria only had 2 playmates growing up her entire life. She had her half-sister, Princess Feodora of Lenigan, and then the Duchess attendant, Sir John Conroy, his daughter, Victoria. I mean, I had like 4 friends growing up, maybe 5.5, but this is just cruel. This is just, unfair. Especially with a royalty too, you'd think you can have more things. No, less. She shared a room with her mother until she was a queen. That entire time, she literally couldn't walk down the hallway alone. Victoria has reflected on her childhood, and yeah, in case you're wondering, she hates John Conrad. She referred to him as a demon incarnate, so she's got the words. Number 2, arsenic dresses. If looks could kill, literally. You've heard of arsenic and old lace at some point, but what exactly are we talking about? Back in 1861, a poet by the name of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, real name, his wife, Fanny, also real name, her dress caught on fire and her burns were so bad that of course she sadly didn't survive. But this was sadly common in Victorian days. Puffy dresses, open candles, as we heard earlier. These dresses back then, they were flammable as is, but some of them were made with literal poison. Some of them had arsenic made to have that like green look, like the real arsenic green look. It wasn't just in clothing either. Back in 1861, an artificial flower maker named Matilda Schurer used green arsenic laced powder, and her fingernails had turned green and green foam started coming out of her mouth, and it was just a horrible way to go out. Arsenic's not supposed to be inhaled, let alone worn. Although yeah, it did look nice for a hot minute. Not worth it. And finally, number 1, Queen Victoria's threats. Being the queen and all, and we're talking about the Victorian era, I figured we'd end with this one. Being the queen and all, a security team is always needed, and during her reign, there were multiple attempts to harm the young queen. The first attack was back in 1840. It was an 18-year-old man named Edward Oxford, and he fired towards the queen's carriage, but obviously and luckily missed. But when Edward was accused of high treason, he was actually found not guilty due to insanity. Then a couple years later, in 1842, it happened again. This time, 2 men fired at her. They were found guilty. In 1849, her carriage was attacked by William Hamilton. In 1850, as the carriage was passing the gates of Buckingham Palace, Robert Pate, a retired soldier, ran up and hit her with his cane. Victoria was okay, thankfully, but of course, she was shook. Then again in 1842, 1849, and 1872, attempt after attempt. But then things got a little worse. If you haven't heard of Boy Jones or anything that happened here, I saved it for last because it's extremely unsettling. A teenager stalked the queen back in 1838 until 1841. Edward Jones, aka Boy Jones. This guy somehow managed to break into Buckingham Palace more than once. It was some Assassin's Creed type stuff. He just knew some back way, he climbed some window or whatever. The guy just knew a route in, so he would break in and would more often than not just hide under the queen's sofa. He would sit on her throne sometimes, and one of the worst things ever, he would go through her drawers and like go through her clothes and stuff. It was creepy. He would steal her clothes until eventually and thankfully he got caught. Of all the things you can do, of all the crimes you want to commit in the Victorian era, you're gonna go hide under a couch for 5 years? Okay, I'm glad he got caught, but just so weird. What a weird ending.